Hello everyone, welcome to the next Modern Indian History lecture series. So in the last video we discussed about the consequences of 1857 revolt, and the consequences of 1857 revolt is very much related to the rise of Indian nationalism, as I told you in the last lecture series. So today we will be speaking about the rise of Indian nationalism. It is very important to know the rise of Indian nationalism because we live in contemporary India, we are nationalistic people. So to know about our nation, we need to go back to the nationalist movement. And especially for UPSC students, this is very important because you see lots of previous year questions on the rise of Indian nationalism. So when we think about Indian nationalism, the main thing that comes to our mind is about the major figures of national movements such as Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh. But then there was a precursor to these major Indian nationalists. How did Indian nationalism grow? This is something that we need to think about, and especially UPSC aspirants should think about this aspect. Because now we have the Indian National Congress. Generally we think that Indian nationalism is associated with Indian National Congress. But much before Indian National Congress, there were the seeds of nationalism that were sown, and it eventually culminated into the making of the Indian National Congress. So we will speak about the slow growth and rise of Indian nationalism, which is also connected to the consequences of 1857 revolt. So we will start our lecture. So there were many factors that were there behind the rise of Indian nationalism. The first and foremost thing is Western education. Western education is very important. Press and print media, the growth of press and print media, economic exploitation, railways and communication, racial discrimination, political unification, and socio-religious reforms. So these are the broader factors that contributed to the rise of Indian nationalism. And these are certain long-standing aspects. As I told you when we discuss about the consequences of revolt of 1857, we need to discuss the long-term consequences. In history, while studying history or modern Indian history also, we need to look at the long-term aspects, not just see it within that time period. So likewise, these aspects are long-term aspects that actually contributed to the rise of Indian nationalism all through the 19th century, because 19th century is the peak time in which the British colonialism was expanding its empire, and also the nationalism is growing. So we have to see it in that overall framework, that entire 19th century framework, and all these aspects are connected to the 19th century framework. The first is Western education. So when we think about Western education, we also need to discuss about Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay. So Thomas Babington Macaulay has an important role in Indian history, because until Thomas Babington Macaulay, you don't see the prevalence of English education. Until then, there was only Oriental languages, languages such as Sanskrit, Tamil, Oriental languages means Indian languages, languages of the East. So most of the languages that were being taught in schools or colleges were Sanskrit, Tamil, Urdu. These are basically Indian languages. These languages were being taught. But when Thomas Babington Macaulay came, he actually made English as a medium of instruction for Indians. And in 1835, his education minute is very important, because in the education minute, he spoke about spreading English education to the natives. And the main purpose of giving education to the natives is to create a loyal subject population among Indians. We had discussed this also during the consequences of the revolt of 1857, that the British are trying to do this strategy of appeasement, and education was one of the means through which they could do. We also discussed about the creation of the Indian civil service in the last lecture series. So English education is something that the British East India Company had tried from 1835 to be implemented across India. So because 1857 revolt also happened because of this factor of British interfering in Indian customs. But then you see that the British also wanted to create a loyal, educated, English educated subject population. But what happened? Even though it was intended to create a loyal subject population from India, it actually backfired against the British. The same middle class, upper caste, English educated people only raised the issues of British colonialism, and that is how we see the growth or the seeds of Indian nationalism. So education is something that is very important, especially English education. Next we will go to the press. We discussed about the Vernacular Press Act during the consequences of the 1857 revolt. Because these educated upper class, upper caste elites, they were the ones who actually started writing in vernacular languages in the newspapers. So around the middle of the 19th century, you see many of these upper class, elite, educated elites writing newspapers in vernacular languages. And vernacular language is very important because they are well read in English, they are also well read in their regional languages. So they can use these regional languages as a tool to resist against the British, because the Britishers cannot anyways read the vernacular languages. And all the criticism against the colonial state can be shown in these regional newspapers. And that is why they implemented the Vernacular Press Act during 1878. Because as I told you in the last lecture series, the English crown was actually fearing expressions of dissent within the vernacular newspapers. So you see the leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who later on becomes a major extremist leader. We will be discussing about the moderates and extremists in the next lecture series. He actually had started newspapers such as Kesari. So Kesari was a Marathi newspaper. He also started a newspaper called Maratha, which is an English language newspaper. So in these newspapers you see the Indians actually showing their discontent or resistance against the English colonial state or the English crown. And as we discussed during the consequences of the revolt of 1857, and as we mentioned in the first slide, the racialization process, the Indians were very much inferiorized due to their racial identity by the British. This created that anger. So they started writing these dissent or expressions of resistance in these vernacular newspapers, and that resulted in the application of the Vernacular Press Act during 1878. So vernacular press, the rise of vernacular press is something that we need to discuss when we discuss about the rise of Indian nationalism. Yesterday when we were discussing about the consequences of 1857 revolt, we also discussed about the economic exploitation. Dadabhai Naoroji, Drain of Wealth, 1867. So Dadabhai Naoroji, whom we will be discussing in the section on moderates in the next lecture series, was one of the fierce critics of British colonialism, because he actually pointed to the economic exploitation that the English East India Company and the British Crown did to India. So we call this phenomenon economic nationalism. So the Indians, the upper class educated, English educated Indians, are actually challenging the English economic policies, such as heavy taxation that the English colonial government had imposed, the deindustrialization, the destroying of Indian handicrafts and the selling of British manufactured goods. These are being critiqued by nationalists such as Dadabhai Naoroji. Also there are nationalists such as R.C. Dutt, Gopalakrishna Gokhale. They were also later nationalists. So these nationalists in the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, they started critiquing the economic policies of English crown, and that is called English economic nationalism. Next is administrative and political unification. So 1857 revolt was not a unified revolt. It was a revolt that happened in the northern part of India, mostly in the northern part of India, and its implications were there in certain parts of western India as well, like Maharashtra, where the doctrine of lapse was implemented. So 1857 revolt was not a unified revolt. You don't see the whole of India participating in the 1857 revolt. But one of the fundamental things about understanding Indian nationalism is the process of unification, administrative and political unification. How the idea of Indianness, being Indian, being together, being one, being unified is very important. And you see that especially after Britain also tried to unify India into one, you see the Charter Acts which try to make the position of Governor General of India. The idea of Indianness is getting promoted. So you see that the British colonialism had facilitated the unification of India, the administrative as well as political unification of India. And not just that, as I told you, English became a language of communication. English became a language of communication among all of them. So there won't be a problem if a Tamil person would communicate with a Bengali. He can communicate in English. Otherwise, India had diverse languages across different states. But now English is a common medium of communication. So across states, people started communicating. English became a mode of communication, and it created an understanding of unity. So there is this process of administrative unification as well as political unification. Not just that, during the second half of the 19th century, the English colonial government had introduced railways. You see Indian railways today. Indian railways was a big revolution in the history of India. Even Mahatma Gandhi had also travelled in the trains to see the Indian villages. So you see that now the communication is becoming more easier. A person from Tamil Nadu can go to Bengal through train. Earlier it was not possible. They had to use bullock carts or other modes of transport. So railways also created a unificatory feeling of being Indian. Not just railways, telegraph. So technology is also connected to the growth of nationalism. Technology. We need to speak about the role of technology, especially railways and telegraph, in creating a unified form of nationalism. Along with that, the postal system. So now Indians from one part of the country could communicate with a distant part of India through postal system, postal letters. So in that sense, you see technology also playing a role in creating a unificatory or common feeling of being Indian. Not just that, the legal system. After the implementation of the Indian Penal Code, you see that the system, the legal system is becoming very unified, becoming very common. Until then, we had Islamic law for the criminal legal system and the customary law of Hindus and Muslims for the civil law system. Now you have a codified law framework, legal framework, which is uniting the whole of India. So you see that there's a kind of unificatory aspect that is growing in India. And this is contributing to the growth of Indian nationalism. The next aspect is local self-government. We don't discuss much about this. Lord Ripon, who was a Governor General, had introduced the idea of local self-government. Today also, even for UPSC aspirants, it is very important to know about the idea of decentralization. Decentralization. So Decentralization is very common. You have the Panchayati Raj system. In Indian polity also, you will be discussing about Panchayati Raj system, municipalities, corporations, how local self-government is very important even while studying Indian administrative service. And it can be gone back to Lord Ripon, because Lord Ripon was one of the pioneers of the local self-government. He was the one who introduced the local self-government in India, and he was a viceroy. In 1882, he had introduced this local self-government. And what is happening with the local self-government? You see Indians being nominated in these local self-governments. There are these district boards and municipal boards where there are Indian members, because as I told you during the consequences of 1857 revolt, Indians are getting nominations in certain governmental positions. And you see that these Indians are getting exposed to various ideas. Indians are getting exposed to the ideas of elections, public assemblies, public administration. So they are becoming politically aware. The Indians are becoming politically aware through these processes. And not just that, many of these Indians, due to this Western education, they are getting exposed to the ideas of nationalism, liberalism, which are actually coming from West. And due to that, their nationalist sentiments are also increasing. But one point that we need to remember strongly is that mostly these nationalists are coming from upper class, English educated and upper caste communities in the initial phase of the nationalism. Along with that, one of the important aspects that we need to discuss with regards to the growth of nationalism is the social-religious reform movements and the idea of cultural revival. You see that from the beginning of the 19th century, you see certain well-educated Indians wanting to change the Indian society, the evil systems that were prevalent within Indian society. They wanted to change that system. For instance, there is this Brahmo Samaj, the famous Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was a social reformer in Bengal. He started the Brahmo Samaj to actually change the Indian society. He had abhorred or criticized the evil practices that were very much prevalent within the Bengali society. He came from Bengal. Aspects such as sati, infanticide, forced widowhood, these aspects he challenged. In fact, due to his persistent pressure only, sati was abolished, which in fact was a major reason for the rise of 1857 revolt. But then you see that certain people who are well educated, they are trying to reform the Indian society, the evil practices within Hindu religion, Islamic religion, etc. because they want to pitch an alternative Indian identity. So it is starting from 1820s. You have Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who established Brahmo Samaj, M.G. Ranade from Maharashtra, who is establishing Prarthana Samaj, which also critiques the evil practices that were very much prevalent within Hindu society, such as caste system, sati, infanticide, etc. M.G. Ranade also makes certain interventions in the sphere of improving the conditions of peasants. And you have the Arya Samaj in 1875, which was started by Dayanand Saraswati in Gujarat. So he also speaks about going back to the Vedas, the original understanding of Vedas, how to go back to the Vedas, how to reform the religion of Hinduism, get rid of the evil practices. And most of them actually spoke of the idea of monotheism, that is one book, one kind of religion, one kind of God, because earlier Hindu religion was connected to polytheism with many gods. So they were literally trying to forge a new Hindu or Indian self through that process. And also the famous Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda in Bengal, they also try to speak about Hindu revivalism, and it is also connected to the larger nationalist movement and Theosophical Society, which was started by H.P. Blavatsky and Alcott. Even though they were coming from the West, they wanted to give more importance to Indian culture, Indian philosophy. So the idea of Indianness was very much connected to reforming the Indian society, the Hindu society, etc. We also see the growth of vernacular literature. We discussed about vernacular newspapers. Along with that, there was the growth of vernacular literature. Vande Mataram, which is the national song of India, was actually written by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in Bengal during 1882. In the book called Anand Math, he discussed about Vande Mataram, and it became the national song of India much later. Not just that, in Hindi literature, there was Bharatendu Harishchandra. So you see that in the domain of novels, short stories, you see the nationalist movement, you see the nationalist feelings being incited. And that too, these books were written in the vernacular languages such as Bengali and Hindi. So you also see that there were certain associations, because generally we tend to associate Indian national movement with Indian National Congress, as I told you in the beginning. But much before Indian National Congress was established, you see certain nationalist, pre-nationalist, pre-Congress associations which tried to inculcate certain problems that Indians were facing. For instance, 1838 Landholders Society, 1839 British India Society, 1851 British Indian Association, 1852 Bombay Association, 1870 Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, 1875 Aligarh Movement, 1876 Indian Association. So these associations actually try to address certain problems that were faced by Indians. Even though it didn't have a unified framework of all Indians, incorporating all Indians, they always tried to raise certain problems that Indians generally try to face. Even though certain organizations such as Pune Sarvajanik Sabha or Bombay associations, they were confined within certain localities such as Bombay and Pune, they tried to raise certain issues that Indians faced due to British colonial oppression. And you see that some of these organizations tried to address the issues of landholders or the landlords. But these were constituted by mostly the educated upper class elites. For instance, M.G. Ranade, about whom we spoke, he actually started this Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. And when he started the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, he actually tried to address many of the issues that the peasants were facing, along with speaking about respecting or preserving Indian culture. So you see that the distinct idea of India is actually evolving through these various organizations, which started much before the establishment of Congress, Indian National Congress. So we will actually end with the last slide, which is speaking about the foundation of Indian National Congress. So we actually try to discuss about how the Indian nationalism evolved over a period of 19th century. So Indian nationalism shouldn't be seen in isolation. It is not just Congress. There were various long-standing processes that was attached to the growth or the rise of Indian nationalism. So I was trying to do that kind of analysis through this video, because it is going back to English education, how it is trying to create an elite upper class who are actually reading the books of English and also getting the feelings of nationalism, and how they're carving their own space. And English education is a very important thing, along with certain technological changes that are happening, the idea of unification that is happening. So these things are facilitating the growth of Indian nationalism. So Indian nationalism shouldn't be seen as just Indian National Congress. It had a long process, and that is why it's very much connected to UPSC as well. Administrative policies also need to be spoken about. And Indian National Congress was the culmination of all these processes. You see the establishment of Indian National Congress in 1885, and it was started by Alan Octavian Hume. Alan Octavian Hume was a former British civil servant. So there is a theory called the safety valve theory. Many historians speak about the safety valve theory. So safety valve theory is a very contested theory, even though it's not established. It says that the British actually started Indian National Congress mainly to satisfy their anger. They themselves, because you see a British retired servant starting this organization to satisfy the growing anger that was evolving among Indians. So they had to appease the Indians. They had to satisfy the anger of the Indians. They had to channelize that anger. So to channelize that anger only, they started the Indian National Congress. And Indian National Congress was an organization that was mainly using petitions. rather than any violent forms of resistance. They were complying with the British government, they were raising certain petitions in the form of certain requests, certain problems, they were not very angry. So in that sense, it was a channelizing mechanism, even though it is not fully established. It is just a theory. Not just that, certain colonial officials, such as Lord Dufferin, had actually criticized the Indian National Congress as a microscopic minority. They are a microscopic minority. Very less number of people are there. So he was criticizing them. They cannot do anything. That was his belief. But then this would turn out against the British government. In the next lecture series, we will be speaking more about the moderates and the extremists, the two groups that evolved within Indian National Congress. So with regards to this idea of rise of Indian nationalism, two questions had come in the previous year question papers of UPSC. In the prelims section, most importantly related to the pre-Congress or pre-moderate phase of Indian nationalism. So the first question is, which came in 2017 prelims, is with reference to the Indian freedom struggle, how many of the following pairs are correctly matched? So it is this side question. So you have the photos of Radhakant Deb, who was the president of British Indian Association. We spoke about British Indian Association. Surendranath Banerjee, who was the founder of Indian Association, and Ghazulu Lakshmi Narasu Chetty, founder of Madras Mahajana Sabha. So three options are given. So they are asking to show the correct options. So the first option is only 1, second option is only 2, that is the first and second. The third options are all 3, and the fourth options are none. So they have given the association's name and the person associated with this association. But you see that in the options, the first 2 are correct. That is Radhakant Deb, who is associated with British Indian Association, and Surendranath Banerjee, who is associated with Indian Association, because these are pre-Congress association. So you have questions about pre-Congress associations, nationalist associations that came in previous year question paper of the UPSC. The second question is related to economic critique, Dadabhai Naoroji, who actually criticized the British economic policies. So a question came related to that in 2011 prelims. The question is, what was the most effective contribution made by Dadabhai Naoroji to the cause of the Indian national movement? So we discussed about his theory of economic exploitation. He exposed the economic exploitation of India by the British. A. B. Interpreted ancient texts, which is a wrong answer. C. Stressed eradication of social evils, wrong answer. D. Promoted mass education, wrong answer. The first option is correct. He exposed the economic exploitation of India by the British. So as UPSC aspirants, it is very important for you to know the pre-Congress phase of Indian nationalism, because there have been questions that have been asked related to that. And that is why I gave a context of the rise of Indian nationalism. In the next lecture series, we will be discussing about the growth of the moderates and extremists, which is very important in the study of Indian nationalism. Thank you so much.